At my husband's funeral, I stood holding a single white rose, ready to say goodbye to the man I had loved for 40 years. But before the first shovel of dirt could fall, a black G Wagon tore across the cemetery lawn, crushing the grass. Out stepped a woman I had never seen, wearing a dress that fit like a second skin, holding the hand of a child who looked exactly like my husband. I turned to my son for support, but he did not walk toward me. He walked toward her. They thought they could humiliate me. They thought they could take everything Elijah and I built. But they forgot one thing. I spent 40 years as a surgical nurse. I know exactly how to cut out the infection to save the body, and by the time the will was read, they would wish they had never parked on my grass. My name is Viola. I am 68 years old, and this is the story of how I lost my husband, but found my spine. Before we continue, please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to Never Too Old channel. We are creating a community of people who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now back to the story. The sound of earth hitting a casket is the most final sound in the world. It is a heavy thud that says it is over. The person you argued with over the thermostat, the man who warmed your feet on cold nights, the partner who built a logistics empire with you from a single beat-up truck is gone. I stood in the front row of the Greater Mount Zion Cemetery, clutching a single white rose so tightly the thorns were digging into my palm through my lace glove. The pastor, Reverend Lewis, was reading from the 23rd Psalm. His voice was deep and comforting, rolling over the hills like thunder. I tried to focus on his words, tried to find the peace that Elijah would have wanted me to have. The air was thick and humid, the kind of Georgia heat that sticks your dress to your back even in October. But I stood tall. My mother raised me to never slouch, especially when the world is watching, and they were watching. The entire congregation was there, business partners form, King Logistics, neighbors we had known since we moved into the subdivision 30 years ago. Then the engine roared. It was not the respectful hum of a hearse or the quiet approach of a family sedan. It was the aggressive growl of a high-performance engine. A matte black Mercedes G Wagon jumped the curb 200 yards away, ignoring the paved path. It drove straight over the manicured lawn, tires churning up the green grass and wet brown earth, leaving deep, ugly scars on the holy ground. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Reverend Lewis stopped reading. I did not turn around at first. I refused to give dignity to disrespect. But the car doors slammed loud as gunshots. I turned. Then the woman who stepped out was stunning in a way that was entirely inappropriate for a funeral. She was young, maybe 30. Her black dress was designer, but it was cut too low and hemmed too high. She wore oversized sunglasses that cost more than my first car. She walked with a sway that demanded attention, her heels sinking into the soft dirt beside the grave, but it was not her that made my heart stop. It was the boy. She was dragging a little boy by the hand. He was about 5 years old, wearing a miniature black suit, and he had Elijah's nose. He had the same wide-set eyes, the same jawline. I looked for my son, Jamal. He was standing to my right, supporting my elbow, or so I thought. Jamal is 40 years old, but in that moment he looked like a child, caught with his hand in the cookie jar. I expected him to step forward, to tell this woman to leave, to protect his mother's dignity. But he did not. He let go of my arm. I felt the loss of his warmth immediately. "Mom," he whispered, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at her. The woman let out a wail. It was theatrical, loud and piercing. "Elijah," she screamed, throwing herself toward the open grave. "My baby daddy, why did you leave us?" My blood ran cold. Baby daddy. The term hung in the air, heavy and toxic. I stepped forward, my instinct to protect my husband's, memory kicking in, but Jamal stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "No, Mom," he said, his voice low. "Wait." He walked past me. He walked past the wife of 40 years to the woman in the tight dress. He took her arm gently, the way he used to hold mine when we crossed icy streets. "It's okay, Keisha," he said soothingly. "We're here now. You have a right to be here." I stood alone. The space beside me where my son had been was empty. the crowd murmured. I could hear the whispers rising like steam. The humiliation was a physical thing, heat rushing up my neck, burning my cheeks. My son was comforting a stranger, while his mother stood alone at his father's grave. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Tiffany, my daughter-in-law. Her touch was light, barely there. She leaned in close, and her perfume expensive and floral cloying in the heat filled my nose. "Don't make a scene. Viola," she whispered. Her voice was sweet, sugary, but underneath it was as sharp as a scalpel. "Dad wanted this. He wanted his family together for the end. Don't make everyone uncomfortable." Family. I looked at the screaming woman, I looked at the child, I looked at my son holding her, I looked at Tiffany, who was smiling a sad, tight little smile at the congregation, playing the part of the grieving peacekeeper. Jamal turned to the pastor reverend. "This is Keisha, my father's spiritual wife, and this is Trey, his son. They should be in the front row." The silence that followed was deafening. Reverend Lewis looked at me, his eyes wide with shock and pity. The church mothers in their large hats fanned themselves vigorously, their eyes darting between me and the woman. Keisha took off her sunglasses. She dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Then she raised her hand to adjust her hair. That was when I saw it. The sunlight caught the diamond on her ring finger. It was a yellow diamond, pear-shaped, surrounded by a halo of smaller stones, unique vintage style. I knew that ring. I had seen the invoice for it 6 months ago on Elijah's American Express statement. It was listed under business expenses, client gift. I had asked him about it, joking that he better not be buying jewelry for clients. He had laughed and kissed my forehead, saying it was a surprise for our 40th anniversary, investing in a future heirloom, he had said. I looked at the ring on her finger, then I looked at the plain gold band on mine, the one we bought at a pawn shop 40 years ago, because we needed the rest of the money for gas for his truck. I did not cry. I spent 20 years as a head nurse in a trauma unit. I have seen bodies broken and torn apart. I have seen families scream when the doctor calls the time of death. I learned a long time ago that when the wound is deep and the bleeding is heavy, panic is death. You have to assess the damage. You have to clamp the artery. You have to breathe. I took a step back, just one step. I straightened my spine. I adjusted the brim of my hat. I looked at Jamal, my only child, the boy I had nursed through fevers and tutored in math, the man I had pushed Elijah to promote even when he wasn't ready. Jamal looked at me, and for a second I saw shame, but then he looked at Keisha, and the shame turned into defiance. "Please proceed." "Reverend," I said. My voice was calm. It did not shake. I was proud of that. "Let us bury my husband." The service finished in a blur. I stared at the mahogany casket, and I wondered who was inside, because the man I thought I knew would never have done this. Or maybe he would. Maybe I had been blind. Maybe the long nights at the office, the sudden business trips, the separate bank accounts for special projects were all pieces of a puzzle I was too trusting to solve. When it was over, the funeral director guided us to the limousines. Usually the immediate family rides together, the widow, the children. But as I walked toward the lead car, the long black Cadillac that Elijah always said was the only way to travel, Jamal stopped me. "Mom," he said. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Tiffany thinks it would be better if Keisha and Trey rode with us." In the lead car, "The boy is upset. He needs to feel close to his dad. And where am I supposed to ride?" Tiffany stepped in, hooking her arm through Jamal's. "There is plenty of room in the second limo. Viola, with Aunt Sarah and Cousin Ray. It's just a short drive back to the house. We just want to keep the peace." They put the mistress in the lead car. They put the wife in the second car with the distant cousins. I watched them get in. Keisha slid onto the leather seat like she belonged there. Jamal lifted the boy, and Tiffany followed, smoothing her skirt before closing the heavy door, ensuring I was shut out. I walked to the second limousine. My legs felt heavy, like I was walking through water. Aunt Sarah was already inside, crying into a tissue. When I sat down, she grabbed my hand. "Oh, Viola," she sobbed. "I never knew. I never knew. Elijah was that kind of man. He wasn't. I said, automatically defending him out of habit. But the words tasted like ash in my mouth. The car pulled away, following the first hearse and the lead limo. We drove through the iron gates and into the city traffic. I looked out the window, watching the world go on, like my life hadn't just shattered. I could hear the whispers starting in the car, Cousin Ray leaning forward to whisper to Sarah, "Did you see the ring? That was a rock? Where did she come from? Since when does Jamal have a brother?" I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the seat. I remembered a night, 5 years ago, Elijah and I were sitting on the patio, drinking iced tea. He had reached over and taken my hand, his palm rough and warm against mine. "Viola," he had said, "you are the rock of this family. I build the trucks, but you build the road. We drive on. I will never let you bow your head in shame. I promise you that." "Liar," I thought. The word echoed in my head. "Liar, liar." But as the car turned onto the highway heading toward the estate that Elijah and I had bought 10 years ago, a cold clarity began to settle over me. They thought I was broken. They thought I was just an old woman who would go quietly into the guest room and cry. They thought the humiliation would silence me. They didn't know that I had installed security cameras in the house 3 days before Elijah died. They didn't know that I had kept my nursing license active. They didn't know that I knew how to read a person better than they knew how to read a balance sheet. We pulled up to the house, my house, or at least it was supposed to be. The driveway was already full of cars. The caterers were setting up for the repast. Tiffany had insisted on handling the food, telling me I needed to rest. I looked at the lead limo, parked right at the front door. I opened my own door before the driver could come around. I stepped out onto the pavement. The heat was still oppressive. The air smelled of rain coming. I was not just a widow. I was Viola Davis. King. I helped build King Logistics from a single truck to a fleet of 500. I managed the payroll when we couldn't afford an accountant. I fired drivers who stole gas. I negotiated contracts with men who wouldn't shake my hand because I was a woman, and because I was black. Jamal and Tiffany and this Keisha woman, they had made the first move. They had struck hard and they had struck publicly, but the funeral was over. The mourning was done. Now the war was hell. Beginning, I walked up the steps to my front door. I did not knock. I walked in. And the first thing I saw was Tiffany standing in the foyer directing the movers to take my favorite armchair out of the living room. "Put that in the small guest room," she was saying. "We need to make space for the playpen." I stood in the doorway watching them. My grief was gone, replaced by a cold, hard rage. It was time to go to work. Tiffany glided across the grass, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth, but she did not falter. She reached me, not with a hug, but with a grip on my elbow that felt more like a restraint than comfort. She leaned in close, the brim of her expensive black hat brushing against my cheek, giving the illusion to the watching crowd that she was consoling a grieving widow. "Viola," she whispered, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she always used when she wanted her way. "This is what Dad wanted. He wanted all his loved ones here." She squeezed my arm tighter, her manicured nails digging in. "Slightly. Don't make a scene. Don't make everyone embarrassed for you." It was a threat wrapped in concern. She looked at me with those cool blue eyes, and I saw the triumph behind them. She wasn't worried about Elijah's memory. She was worried about the spectacle. She was worried about her own image. I tried to pull my arm away, but my eyes were drawn to the nightmare unfolding 3 feet away. Jamal had his arm around the crying woman, Keisha. He looked at Reverend Lewis, who stood with his Bible open, his mouth slightly ajar, unable to find the scripture for this kind of disrespect. Reverend Jamal said, his voice projecting clearly so the front row could hear, "I want you to meet Keisha. She was my father's spiritual wife." Spiritual wife. The words hung in the humid air like a toxic cloud. A murmur went through the crowd. I saw Mrs. Johnson, the head of the choir, clutch her chest, staring at Keisha's tight dress. Jamal continued, ignoring the shock. She was his soulmate in his final years, Reverend, he would want. Her standing right here next to me, spiritual wife, soulmate. These were words used to describe a woman who drove a luxury SUV onto a grave. I felt the blood drain from my face. My son, the boy I raised to be a man of honor, was standing over his father's, open casket rewriting our entire history. He was erasing 40 years of marriage, 40 years of struggle and triumph, replacing it with this cheap soap opera. He looked at me. Then a quick glance, full of defiance. He was choosing his side. He was betting on the new horse. Keisha wiped her eyes with a dramatic flourish. She reached out to touch the casket, her hand hovering over the polished wood, claiming it, claiming him. That was when the sun hit it again. That flash of light. I focused on her left hand, the yellow diamond ring. I remembered the night I found the invoice on Elijah's desk. 6 months ago. King Logistics business expense. $25,000. I had asked him about it, teasing him that he was spending too much on clients. He had smiled, that charming smile of his, and said, "It is an investment, V. For the future." I thought he meant our future. I thought he meant an anniversary gift he was hiding until the right moment. But there it was, on her finger, the investment. It wasn't just an affair. It was theft. He had bought that ring with our money. Money we made from the contracts I negotiated. He had given it to this woman while I was at home, managing his diet and organizing his medications. The rage started then. It wasn't the hot, fiery anger of a jealous wife. It was cold. It was the cold, clinical focus of a nurse in the operating room when the patient starts crashing. I looked at the ring. I looked at Tiffany smirking. I looked at Jamal playing the protector to a stranger. I realized then that the man in the box wasn't the man I married, and the people standing around me weren't my family. They were vultures, and I was the carcass. They were waiting to pick clean, but they forgot one thing. I wasn't dead yet. The funeral director, a man I had known for 20 years, refused to meet my eyes. He placed a gloved hand gently but firmly on the small of my back, guiding me away from the lead limousine. "This way, Mrs. King," he murmured, steering me toward the second car. The stretch Lincoln usually reserved for distant cousins and overflow guests. I dug my heels into the pavement for a split second, wanting to protest, to demand my place next to my son. But then I saw them. Jamal was holding the door of the lead car open. Keisha slid inside, adjusting her skirt, her diamond ring catching the afternoon light one last time before she disappeared behind the tinted glass. Tiffany followed her, shooting a glance back at me that was not apologetic, but triumphant. Then Jamal got in, and the heavy door slammed shut, sealing them in and shutting me out. They were the family now. I was just the widow. The relic. I allowed myself to be ushered into the second car. The air conditioning was blasting too high, chilling the sweat on my neck. Inside it smelled of peppermint and old dust. Aunt Sarah was there squeezing herself into the corner. Next to her were Mother Patterson and Sister Jenkins, the oldest matriarchs of Greater Mount Zion Church. They adjusted their hats and shifted their bulk, making room for me, but the space felt tight, claustrophobic. As the car pulled away, following the lead limo down the winding cemetery road, the silence did not last long. It never does with them. "Lord have mercy." Mother Patterson whispered loud enough for the driver to hear. "Did you see that child? He has Elijah's walk. Sure as I am sitting here, that is a king boy." Sister Jenkins hummed in agreement, fanning herself with a funeral program. "You cannot deny blood." The way he held his head, just like Elijah back in the day. Poor Viola. To find out like this in front of God and everybody, it is a trial. Lord, it is a trial. They spoke as if I were not there, or perhaps as if I were already dead, a ghost haunting the upholstery. I stared out the tinted window, watching the familiar streets of Atlanta roll by. We passed the old spot where Elijah and I had our first date, a diner that was now a parking lot. I remembered a night 30 years ago. We were standing on the porch of our first house, watching a storm roll in. I was worried about money, about the business, about the future. Elijah had wrapped his arms around me, his chest solid against my back. "Viola," he had said, his voice low and rough with promise. "Look at me. I will never let you bow your head. You hear me? You walk with your head high, because you are my queen. I will never let the world shame you. I watched the lead limousine turn a corner ahead of us, carrying the woman he had bought diamonds for and the son he had hidden from me. Was that promise a lie? Was every "I love you" just a cover for a secret life? I looked at my reflection in the glass. My hat was straight, my chin was up, but inside I was bowing, I was crumbling. The man who promised to protect me from shame had orchestrated my public execution, and as the church, mothers clucked their tongues and pitied the poor foolish wife, I realized that the only person who could lift my head now was me. The tears threatened to spill, but I swallowed them down, bitter and hot. Elijah broke his promise, but I would not break mine. I would survive this, and I would make them pay for every whisper. The limousine pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the estate Elijah and I had built 10 years ago. The house stood tall and proud against the gray sky, a monument to every mile he drove and every contract I negotiated. But as I stepped out of the car, the first thing I noticed was the smell, or rather, the lack of it. A repast in our community is supposed to smell like comfort. It should smell of collard greens, simmering with smoked turkey of baked macaroni and cheese, bubbling in the oven of fried chicken and sweet potato pie. It is the food that heals, the food that tells the family life goes on. But the air in my foyer was cold and sterile, smelling only of expensive lilies and Tiffany's cloying perfume. I walked into the dining hall and stopped. The long mahogany table where we had hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 30 people was unrecognizable. Gone were the chafing dishes full of the soul food Elijah had specifically requested in his final wishes. Instead, there were silver platters of cold hors d'oeuvres, tiny cucumber sandwiches with the crusts cut off, smoked salmon on dry crackers, miniature quiches that looked like plastic. The church mothers were standing by the buffet plates in hand, looking confused and insulted. Mother Patterson caught my eye and shook her head slightly, putting her plate down without taking a bite. This was not a celebration of Elijah's life. This was a cocktail party for strangers, and it was Tiffany's doing. She had erased his culture at his own funeral, replacing the warmth of our heritage with this cold European pretension. I moved through the crowd, nodding to people I barely recognized, trying to find a glass of water. Keisha was in the living room, holding a champagne flute, walking around as if she were touring an open house. She ran a manicured hand over the back of my velvet sofa, the one I had custom ordered from Italy. I heard her voice carry over the low murmur of conversation. "It is just so dark in here," she was saying to one of Jamal's friends. "So heavy and dated. First thing I would do is paint everything white. Open it up. Get rid of all this old wood. It feels like a museum." My hands curled into fists at my sides. That old wood was hand-carved mahogany. That dated furniture was chosen by Elijah and me over decades of building a life together. She was measuring my home for a coffin before I was even in the ground. Jamal was standing near the fireplace, watching her with a look I had never seen before, a mix of lust and submission. He wasn't grieving his father. He was auditioning for her approval. I needed to get away from them. I needed air. I needed water. I turned and headed for the kitchen, the one place in this house that had always been my sanctuary. The swinging door pushed open silently, and I stepped onto the cool tile, expecting to find the catering staff. Instead, I found Tiffany. She was standing by the large industrial trash can near the pantry, her back to me. She was digging into her purse, looking frantic. She pulled out 3 orange prescription bottles and dropped them into the garbage, then quickly grabbed a handful of used paper napkins from the counter and stuffed them on top to bury the evidence. My nurse's training kicked in instantly. Observation assessment. Action. I stayed in the shadows of the doorframe, watching. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes darting around the empty kitchen, guilty and nervous. When she was sure no one was there, she smoothed her black dress, took a deep breath, and pushed back through the service door into the hallway, her mask of the grieving daughter-in-law slipping back into place. I waited a full 10 seconds, then I walked to the trash can. I didn't care about the mess. I reached in and moved the napkins aside. There they were. 3 bottles of digoxin, Elijah's heart medication. But when I picked them up, they felt wrong. They were light empty. I checked the dates on the labels. These had been refilled only 4 days ago. Elijah died yesterday. There should have been pills left. Why would she throw away active medication at a funeral unless she didn't want anyone to know what was or wasn't inside them? I slipped one of the empty bottles into the pocket of my dress. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't just disrespect. This was something else, something dangerous, and I was going to find out what. The last guest had finally driven away, leaving only the silence of a house that had been invaded. The catering staff was gone. The kitchen was dark. I walked toward the grand staircase, my hand gripping the polished mahogany banister. My feet throbbed in my heels, and every bone in my body ached with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle. I just wanted to take off my dress, wash my face, and lie down in my bed. The bed I had shared with Elijah for 30 years. The bed where we whispered about business deals in the dark. The bed where we conceived the son who was now standing at the top of the stairs blocking my path. Jamal stood on the landing, looking down at me. He had taken off his suit jacket and loosened his tie. He looked so much like his father in that moment, tall and broad-shouldered, but his eyes were cold. They were stranger's eyes. "Mom," he said, holding up a hand like a traffic cop. "Stop right there. We made some changes to the sleeping arrangements for tonight." I paused, my hand tightening on the wood. "What are you talking about, Jamal?" "I am going to my room." He shook his head slowly, coming down one step as if to physically push me back. "No, Mom. You aren't Keisha, and Trey are going to sleep in the master suite tonight. The boy is traumatized, Mom. He is confused. He needs to feel his father's presence. He needs to be surrounded by his dad's scent to feel safe. It is what Dad would have wanted." The air left my lungs. I looked up at him, trying to find the little boy I had raised, the boy who used to crawl into that very bed when he had nightmares. Now he was using my sanctuary as a comfort blanket for his father's, mistress and her child. My room, my sheets, my sanctuary. He was evicting me from my own marriage bed to make room for the woman who had helped destroy it. "And where exactly am I supposed to sleep?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "We set up the small guest room for you," Jamal said, pointing toward the back of the hallway near the kitchen, the one by the laundry room. "It is cozy. You will be more comfortable there, quieter. You know how you like quiet?" I didn't say another word. I turned and walked down the hall to the small guest room. It was a room we usually reserved for the housekeeper when she stayed late or for overflow storage. I pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted me was a physical blow. They hadn't just moved me. They had discarded me, my clothes, my silk robes, my slippers. The framed photos from my vanity were not unpacked. They were stuffed into black industrial trash bags piled in the corner like garbage. 3 shiny black mounds sitting on the cheap rug. My entire life, my dignity, my history shoved into plastic sacks to make room for Keisha. I walked over to the bags. I touched the plastic. It was cold, slick. I could see the outline of my favorite perfume bottle pressing against the side. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the evidence of my erasure. They thought they had won. They thought that by moving me into the servants' quarters, they had put me in my place. But a nurse knows that you do not fight the patient when they are in a delirium. You wait, you observe, you document. I turned around and walked back out into the living room. Jamal was gone upstairs, probably settling his new family into my bed. The room was empty except for the dying flowers and the smell of stale food. I walked to the stone fireplace. On the mantel sat the only thing they had forgotten, a silver-framed photograph of Elijah and me on our wedding day. We were young, smiling, unaware of the future. I picked it up. The silver was cool in my hand. I looked at Elijah's face, young and full of promises he wouldn't keep. I tucked the photo under my arm, like a patient chart. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I simply walked back to the small room and closed the door, locking it from the inside. If they wanted a war, they had one, but they had made a fatal error. They thought by pushing me into the shadows they were hiding me, but the shadows are where I do my best work. The shadows are where you can see everything without being seen. It was past midnight when the knock came on the guest room door. I was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, still in my funeral dress, staring at the wall. Jamal and Tiffany entered without waiting for an invitation. Tiffany was holding a piece of paper, handling it like it was a holy relic, though it looked more like trash. It was a single sheet of yellow legal pad paper, wrinkled and stained as if it had been balled up in a fist and then smoothed out again. "We found this," Tiffany said, her voice hushed and serious. "In Dad's bedside drawer. It is his final wishes, Viola. We thought you should see it before the lawyers get involved." She extended the paper toward me. I didn't want to touch it, but I had to know I took it. The paper felt thin and cheap. I turned on the small bedside lamp and adjusted my glasses. The handwriting was a disaster. Elijah had always had penmanship that matched his character, bold, sweeping, confident. But this was a spider scrawl. The letters were jagged, trailing off the lines, the pressure uneven. I read the words and they hit me like physical blows. I, Elijah King, being of sound mind, leave full operational control of King Logistics to my son Jamal and my soulmate Keisha. My wife Viola has been a cold partner to me, more interested in business than my heart. She is too. Receive a stipend but no control. She never understood me. A cold partner. The man who had wept in my arms when his mother died, the man whose feet I had rubbed every night for 30 years, the man I had built a kingdom with. He didn't write this, or if he did, he wasn't the Elijah I knew. I looked closer at the signature. It wasn't just messy, it was tremulous. There was a specific kind of shake to the lines, a jagged oscillation that a trained eye recognizes immediately. I had seen that tremor 100 times in the ICU. It was the tremor of a patient whose nervous system is flooded with opioids. I closed my eyes and went back to last week, Tuesday, the day the hospice nurse increased his morphine drip to manage the breakthrough pain. Elijah had been drifting in and out, hallucinating about his childhood dog, barely able to lift a spoon to his mouth. He didn't know what day it was. He didn't know who I was for half the afternoon. "When was this written?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. Jamal shifted his weight about 3 days before he passed. "He was very clear, Mom. He was adamant 3 days before. That was the day I had gone to the pharmacy for 2 hours to sort out an insurance issue. The only time I had left his side. He was on 80 milligrams of morphine," I said, looking up at them. "He couldn't hold a cup of water without spilling it. But you want me to believe he wrote a coherent estate plan transferring a multi-million-dollar company to his mistress. He had moments of clarity." Tiffany snapped her mask, slipping. "He knew what he wanted. He wanted happiness. He wanted Keisha." I looked at the paper again. The ink was smudged in the corner like someone had held the paper down forcibly while the pen dragged across it. This wasn't a last will and testament, it was a crime scene. "Get out!" I said. "Mom, you need to accept." Jamal started. I said, "Get out." I stood up, and despite the small room, despite the trash bags in the corner, I filled the space. "Take your paper, take your lies, and get out of my room." They retreated, looking smug, thinking the piece of paper was their golden ticket, but they didn't know what I knew. They saw a letter. I saw evidence. As the door clicked shut, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my dignity anymore. I was fighting a murder. They hadn't just broken his heart, they had exploited his dying brain, and I was going to prove it. I waited until the floorboards overhead stopped creaking. The house finally settled into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen next door. I got up and turned the lock on the guest room door. It was a flimsy privacy lock meant to keep a maid from walking in on a changing guest, not to keep out enemies, but it would have to do. I reached into the bottom of the black trash bag Jamal had stuffed my life into and pulled out my old laptop. It was heavy and thick, a relic by today's standards, but it had one feature that mattered. It was the only device I owned that wasn't connected to the family cloud network. 3 days before Elijah died, I had a feeling, not a wife's feeling, but a nurse's feeling. I had noticed his pills count was off. The digoxins seemed to be disappearing too fast, and he was more lethargic than his condition warranted. So while Jamal took Tiffany out for lunch and the nurse was on break, I had a security technician I knew from the old days come in the back service entrance. We installed 3 pinhole cameras, one in the study, one in the living room, and one directly facing the master bed, hidden in the smoke detector. I opened the laptop and logged into the secure server. The screen glowed blue in the dark room, illuminating the trash bags piled around me. My hands hovered over the trackpad. I scrolled back to Tuesday. The timestamp read 2:14 p.m. The exact time I had been at the pharmacy, arguing with the pharmacist about a copay. A errand. Tiffany had insisted I handle personally. I clicked play. The video feed was crisp, high definition, audio and video. The master bedroom appeared. Elijah was propped up on pillows, his head lolling to the side, mouth open. He looked like a rag doll, his spirit already half gone. The door opened and they filed in like a hit squad. Tiffany led the way, holding the yellow legal pad. Jamal followed, looking pale and sweaty, and bringing up the rear was Keisha. I leaned closer to the screen, watching my worst fears play out in 1080p. "Wake him up!" Tiffany snapped, her voice tinny through the speakers. Jamal shook his father's shoulder. Dad, you need to sign this." Elijah let out a moan, a low sound of distress, but his eyes didn't open. He was deep in the morphine fog, deeper than he should have been. "He is not waking up," Jamal said, his voice cracking. "He is out of it, Tiff. Just do it," Tiffany hissed. Grabbing Elijah's limp hand, she shoved the pen between his fingers, wrapping his cold knuckles around the barrel. Jamal grabbed his father's wrist, guiding the hand to the paper. I watched in horror as my son physically forced his dying father's hand to move, creating the jagged spider scrawl I had seen on the letter. It wasn't a signature. It was assault. Keisha stepped into the frame, checking her reflection in the mirror over the dresser. "Make sure it is legible," she said casually, picking at a lint ball on her dress, "and make sure the house is listed specifically. I don't want to fight the old woman for the real estate. I want this room. The light is perfect for my selfies." "Don't worry," Jamal grunted, putting his weight behind his father's arm to force the pen down. "We split everything 3 ways just like we agreed. The company, the accounts, the properties. Mom's out. You get your share, we get ours." "I want it in writing," Keisha said. "You are seeing it in writing right now," Tiffany snapped. "Stop talking and watch the door." I paused the video. The image froze on Jamal's face, twisted in concentration, as he committed fraud against his own father. His hand clamped over Elijah's frail wrist. I stared at it for a long time, letting the image burn into my retinas. They hadn't just forged a will. They had tortured a dying man to do it. I saved the file, then I saved it again to an external hard drive, and then I emailed it to an encrypted account I had set up years ago. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. The tears finally came hot and fast, but they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of relief. They had handed me the weapon I needed. All I had to do now was wait for the right moment to pull the trigger. A soft tap on the window pane broke the silence, making me jump. I turned off the laptop screen, instantly plunging the room back into darkness. The tap came again, rhythmic and insistent. 3 short knocks. Pause. 2 long ones. I knew that code. It was the signal Marcus and I used when he was little and wanted to sneak extra cookies before dinner. I went to the window and unlatched it, sliding it up quietly. Marcus slid through the opening with the grace of a cat, landing softly on the rug beside the trash bags. He was 19 now, tall and lanky, with paint splattered on his jeans and a sketchbook sticking out of his back pocket. His parents. Jamal and Tiffany called him a disappointment because he wanted to be an artist instead of a corporate shark. But Elijah had loved him. Elijah had bought him his first easel. "Grandma," he whispered, pulling me into a fierce hug. "I saw what they did, the way they treated you at the funeral. Moving you down here, it is messed up." I held him tight, grounding myself in his familiar scent of turpentine and mint gum. "I'm okay, Marcus," I whispered back. "I have a plan." He pulled back, reaching into his oversized hoodie. "I have something for you." He pulled out a sleek silver iPad Pro. It was Elijah's personal tablet, the one he used for everything but business. Or so we thought. "Grandpa gave this to me 2 weeks ago," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "He made me promise to hide it. He said, Do not let your father or your mother see this. Wait until they show their true colors, then give it to your grandmother. My hands trembled as I took the device. It was heavy cool to the touch. Why didn't he give it to me himself? He didn't want them to know you had it. He said you needed an ace in the hole. I pressed the power button. The screen lit up, illuminating our faces in a ghostly blue glow. It asked for a passcode. 6 digits. I looked at Marcus. He told me the hint, Marcus said. He said, "The password is the day she saved my life. The day of the truck accident in '90. I closed my eyes, remembering. It was a rainy Tuesday in November 1990. Elijah had been driving a delivery route himself, covering for a sick driver. A drunk driver in a pickup had run a red light to boning the truck. Elijah had been trapped, the cab crushing in around him. I had been following him in my car, bringing him lunch. I ran to the wreckage, pulled him out just seconds before the fuel tank ignited. November 14th, 1990. I typed in, 490. The screen unlocked. We were in. There were no apps, just files, folders labeled Journal Audio Logs, and one simply one, titled The Truth. I opened The Truth. First, it was full of audio recordings, voice memos Elijah had made over the last 6 months. I clicked on the most recent one, dated a week before he died. My heart hammered against my ribs as Elijah's voice filled the small room, weak but clear. Viola, if you are hearing this, then I am gone. And if Marcus gave this to you, it means Jamal and Tiffany have made their move. I am sorry. I couldn't tell you everything, baby. I was ashamed. Ashamed that I raised a son who would steal from me. Ashamed that I let that woman Tiffany into our lives. I looked at Marcus. Tears were streaming down his face, silent and fast. We sat there on the floor, huddled over the glowing screen, listening to the ghost of the man we loved tell us the secrets he had died keeping. And as the files opened one by one, revealing bank transfers, emails, and photos, I realized this wasn't just a diary. It was a dossier. Elijah hadn't just been dying. He had been building a case, and he had left me the pasquin. Key Marcus and I huddled over the iPad, scrolling through a folder simply labeled K. The first file wasn't a love letter or a photo of a romantic getaway. It was a PDF of an email chain. The subject line read, "Payment schedule. Urgent." I clicked it open. The sender was Keisha. The recipient was Tiffany. Dated 3 months ago. The email didn't sound like a grieving soulmate. It sounded like a disgruntled employee. "Tiffany," the email read, "I need the second installment of the $50,000 by Friday. I have done everything you asked. I memorized the backstory about meeting Elijah at the jazz festival. I bought the clothes you picked out. I even got Trey a haircut to match the photo you sent. If I do not see the wire transfer, I am walking, and I am taking the scripts you wrote with me." Scripts! I looked at Marcus, his eyes wide in the blue glow of the screen. We kept scrolling. There were attachments, scanned documents, a casting call from a website for freelance actors seeking African American. Female age, 25 to 35, convincing emotional range, ability to improvise, discreet luxury environment. Keisha wasn't a mistress. She was a gig worker. She was an unemployed actress. Tiffany had found online, hired to play the role of a lifetime, the homewrecker. And the pay was $50,000 plus expenses, which explained the G Wagon and the diamond ring. It wasn't an affair, it was a production. Then we found the file on the boy Trey. My heart had broken for that child, thinking he was Elijah's son, thinking he would grow up without a father. But the file contained a birth certificate. The mother was listed as Monique Davis, Keisha's sister. The father was listed as unknown. But there was a side-by-side comparison photo attached. A picture of Elijah from the 1980s and a picture of Trey Tiffany had circled the nose and the chin in red marker notes in the margins, saying, "Style his hair like this. It will sell the resemblance." "He is a prop," I whispered, the horror rising in my throat like bile. They used a 5-year-old child as a prop. They dressed him up, coached him. Probably promised him candy or toys just to use him as a battering ram against me. Why? Marcus asked, his voice trembling with rage. Why go through all this trouble? Why not just forge the will and be done with it? Because of the law, I said, realizing the sheer evil brilliance of their plan. In Georgia, you cannot easily disinherit a spouse. But if there is a secret child, a dependent, the court looks differently at asset division. If Elijah had a second family, a vulnerable child he wanted to provide for, it gives them a legal foothold to challenge the spousal share. It creates chaos. It forces a settlement. It creates a narrative that I am the bitter old woman standing in the way of a child's future. They didn't just want to steal the money, they wanted to destroy my reputation. They wanted to make sure that when they kicked me out of my own house, the community would applaud them for doing it. They wanted to be the heroes protecting an innocent child from the wicked stepmother. I looked at the emails again. Tiffany's replies were cold, calculating. Make sure you cry loud enough at the funeral, she had written. The old church ladies need to feel sorry for you. If you can faint, even better. I felt a cold calm settle over me deeper than the rage. It was the calm of a surgeon picking up a scalpel. They had turned my life into a stage play. They had written a script, cast the actors and directed the scene, but they forgot one thing. In live theater, anything can happen, and the final act was yet to be written. I looked at Marcus. Download everything I said, then send a copy to Henderson. Who is Henderson? Marcus asked my lawyer. I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt. The only man your grandfather trusted more than me, and the man who is going to help us bring the curtain down on this whole show. The digital clock on the nightstand blinked. 3:14 a.m., the witching hour. In the hospital, that is when the fever breaks or the heart stops in my house. It was when I made the call that would end my son's life as he knew it. I dialed the private number for Arthur Henderson, Elijah's attorney and oldest friend. He answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly with sleep but alert, instantly. Viola, he said simply. He did not ask why I was calling at such an ungodly hour. He knew. They made their move. Arthur, I said, my voice steady in the darkness. They have a fake will, they have a fake child, and they have a fake wife. I heard the rustle of sheets on the other end, the click of a bedside lamp turning on, then a heavy sigh that sounded like 50 years of carrying secrets. So it begins, Henderson said. He did not sound surprised. He sounded resigned. You knew, I asked, the realization hitting me cold. You knew they would do this. Elijah knew, Viola Henderson said. His voice was soft now, gentle. Elijah found out 5 years ago. Jamal started skimming from the fuel accounts, just a little at first, padding the receipts. But then it grew. Elijah hired a forensic accountant quietly. He found transfers to accounts linked to Tiffany. He found the gambling debts. He found the shell companies. My hand flew to my mouth, curbing a sob. My husband had carried the knowledge that his only son was a thief for 5 years, and he had never told me. He had protected me from the heartbreak even while it was breaking his own heart. Why didn't he stop him? I whispered. Why didn't he fire him? Because he was his son, Henderson said. And because Elijah knew that if he fired him, Jamal would just find another way to destroy the legacy. He wanted to give him enough rope to hang himself, and he wanted to make sure when the trap snapped shut, it would be permanent. Elijah called it the nuclear option. The nuclear option. The words hung in the air, ominous and final. I have the evidence, Arthur. I said I have the video of them forcing him to sign. I have the emails proving the woman is an actress. I have everything. Good, Henderson said. Bring it all to me tomorrow. But Viola, listen to me very carefully. This is the most important part until the reading of the will. You have to do exactly what they expect. You have to be the broken widow. You have to be the confused old woman who has lost her fight. Let them think they have won. Let them get comfortable. Let them sign their names to the fraud. You want me to act? I asked, looking at the black trash bags in the corner. I want you to give the performance of your life, Henderson said. They need to believe you are defeated. If they smell a trap, they will run. We need them in the room. Viola, We need them sitting at the table thinking they are kings right before we take the crown. I understood. It was triage. You let the infection surface so you can see exactly how deep to cut. I can do that, I said, feeling the cold nurse's mask sliding back into place. I can play the victim. Good, Henderson said. I will set the reading for Friday. That gives them 4 days to dig their own graves. Get some sleep, Viola. You are going to need your... You are going to. Strength. The nuclear option is not just a legal strategy. It is a demolition. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark listening to the silence of the house that was about to become a battlefield. They thought they had hired an actress to play a role, but they didn't realize that I had been rehearsing for this moment my entire life. I laid back on the narrow guest bed, and for the first time since the funeral, I closed my eyes and slept the dreamless sleep of a soldier on the eve of victory. The days leading up to Friday were a slow, suffocating torture designed to break a spirit that was already cracked. Tiffany did not waste a single second acting as the new mistress of the manor. On Tuesday morning, I was sitting in the small guest room trying to read my Bible when the house shook. The sound of sledgehammers hitting plaster echoed through the halls like bones breaking. I walked out to the foyer, clutching my shawl around my shoulders, playing the part of the frail, confused widow Dust was billowing out from under the double doors of Elijah's library. That room was his sanctuary. It was where he read his history books, where he smoked his cigars on Sunday evenings, where he taught Marcus how to play chess. It smelled of old paper and tobacco and safety. I pushed open the doors and coughed as a cloud of white drywall dust hit my face. A crew of workmen were tearing down the built-in mahogany bookshelves. The shelves Elijah had installed, himself piling the wood in the center of the room like kindling. Tiffany stood in the middle of the chaos, wearing a hard hat that looked ridiculous with her designer dress holding a tablet. "Careful with that wall," she shouted over the noise. "We need the space open for the mirror wall. The Peloton bikes are going right there." She turned and saw me standing in the doorway, ghost-like in the dust. "Oh, Viola," she said, her voice dismissive. "We are converting this dusty old room into a home gym. Jamal needs to get back in shape, and honestly, books are just dust. Collectors, right?" She was erasing him. She wasn't just remodeling. She was scrubbing Elijah King from the face of the earth. I looked at the pile of mahogany. The wood was splintered, broken. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the sledgehammer and swing it at her perfect teeth. But I remembered Henderson's voice. Let them get comfortable. So I just coughed, pulled my shawl tighter, and turned away, muttering something about the noise giving me a headache. Tiffany laughed, a short, sharp bark of victory. On Wednesday, it was Jamal. He decided that the mourning period was over and it was time to enjoy his inheritance. He walked into the garage where Elijah kept his pride and joy, a 1967 Chevy Impala convertible, candy apple red with white interior. Elijah treated that car better than he treated his own knees. He only drove it on sunny Sundays, and he polished it with a cloth diaper so it wouldn't scratch. Jamal backed it out of the garage, the engine roaring too loud, revving it like a teenager trying to impress a girl. He threw his golf clubs into the back seat, not in the trunk on the white leather upholstery I watched from the kitchen window as he carelessly tossed the heavy bag metal irons clanking against the pristine interior. Then as he backed out, he cut the wheel too hard. The rear fender scraped against the brick pillar of the driveway gate. The sound of metal screeching on stone tore through me. Jamal didn't even stop to check. He just cursed loudly, revved the engine again, and peeled out of the driveway, leaving tire marks on the pavement. I sat in my rocking chair in the corner of the kitchen, mending an old quilt, acting like I hadn't seen a thing. Keisha walked by, eating an apple from my fruit bowl, and stopped to watch me. "Look at you," she sneered, "just stitching away while the world changes around you. You really are yesterday's news, aren't you?" I bit the thread, snapping it clean. I looked at her, not with anger, but with the blank stare of someone who has given up. "You might be right, dear," said softly. Just yesterday's news, they saw a defeated old woman sewing scraps of cloth together. They didn't see the spider weaving a web. They didn't know that every insult, every broken shelf, every scratch on that car was just adding fuel to the fire that was about to consume them. Let them have their fun, I thought. Let them break the walls and scratch the paint. Because on Friday I was going to take the only thing that mattered to them, I was going to take the money, and I was going to watch them burn. Friday morning arrived with a brightness that felt like an insult. The sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the air where Elijah's library wall used to be. Tiffany had transformed the living room not into a place of solemn legal business, but into a VIP lounge for her victory lap. She had invited people, not family, not close friends, but her social climbing circle. The women from the country club, the wives of local politicians, the people she wanted to impress with, her new status as the matriarch of the King Empire. They sat on my furniture sipping mimosas that Tiffany had the caterers serve, treating the reading of my husband's. Well, like a spectator sport. I stood in the corner wearing a simple black dress, holding my purse with both hands, watching them dissect my life with their eyes. "Look at her," one woman whispered behind her champagne flute. "She looks so frail. I heard they are moving her to Shady Pines next week. It is for the best. Really, Tiffany is a saint for handling it." Keisha was the centerpiece of this circus. She wasn't wearing black. She was wearing a fire engine red jumpsuit that screamed, "Look at me!" She sat on the center cushion of the sofa, her legs crossed, ankles resting casually on the antique coffee table Elijah's mother had brought from New Orleans. She was scrolling through her phone, ignoring the guests, acting like a bored queen waiting for her coronation. The sheer disrespect of that red fabric against the beige velvet made my teeth ache. Then Jamal's lawyer arrived. He was a man named Sterling, slick as oil, with a suit that cost more than a nurse's yearly salary. He walked in, checking his gold watch, laughing loudly at something Jamal said. He looked at me, and then he looked at Arthur Henderson, who had just shuffled through the front door. Henderson played his part perfectly. He walked with a heavy stoop, clutching his battered leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. He wore a suit that was 20 years out of style and glasses that slipped down his nose. Sterling actually snorted when he saw him. He leaned over to Jamal and whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. "That is the opposition. I hope you brought coloring books, because this is going to be child's play." Henderson didn't react. He just walked to the head of the room, moving slow, painfully slow. He set his briefcase down on the table with trembling hands. He took a long time to open the latches, fumbling with the mechanism. Tiffany rolled her eyes audibly, checking her manicure. "Can we speed this up?" "Mr. Henderson, we have a reservation for lunch to celebrate." Henderson looked up over his spectacles, his eyes watery and dim, acting the part of the confused old retainer. "Of course, Mrs. King," he stammered. "I apologize. My hands aren't what they used to be." Sterling smirked, walking over to the table and slamming his own sleek leather folio down, shaking the table. Dominance. It was a cheap move, but it worked on this crowd. They leaned forward, eager to see the shark eat the minnow. I watched from my corner, feeling the weight of the iPad in my purse, waiting for the moment. The shark realized he was swimming in a pool of blood, and it was his own. Just as Henderson finally managed to unlatch his briefcase, Tiffany cleared her throat. It was a sharp sound designed to cut through the murmurs of her guests, like a knife cutting cake. She stood up, smoothing her dress, and walked over to where I was standing. Her smile was tight, her eyes hard as diamonds. "Viola," she said, pitching her voice so everyone could hear. "We have a little surprise for you. Before we get into the messy legal details, Jamal and I wanted to offer you something special." She pulled a document from a folder held by Sterling. It was thick, bound in blue paper. She held it out to me, but she didn't let go when I reached for it. She held it just out of reach, forcing me to step forward, forcing me to look eager. "This is a settlement agreement," she announced to the room. "We know the will is going to be difficult for you to process, given Dad's new family dynamics, so out of the kindness of our hearts, we are offering you a stipend, $5,000 a month for life, and we have already paid the deposit for a suite at Golden Horizons. It is the best assisted living facility in the state. Luxury care, Viola. You will never have to lift a finger again. $5,000 a month. To live in a nursing home while they lived in my house and spent my husband's millions. It was an insult wrapped in a gift box. It was a golden cage." "Just sign here," Tiffany said. tapping a line on the last page with a manicured fingernail. "If you sign now, we don't even have to read the will. You can just go pack your things and the car will take you to your new home if you don't sign." She let the threat hang in the air, heavy and sweet. "If you don't sign, you get nothing. The will leaves everything to the new family. You will be on the street, Viola, penniless. Is that what you want?" At your age? I looked at the pen she was holding out. It was a Mont Blanc, Elijah's favorite pen. She had taken it from his desk. I looked at Jamal. He was staring at the floor, unable to watch his mother being extorted. I looked at Keisha, who was inspecting her nails, bored by the delay. I took the pen. My hand shook, a genuine tremor of rage that they mistook for weakness. I brought the tip down to the paper. I could feel the eyes of every person in the room on me, the socialites, the lawyer, the son who had betrayed me. They were holding their breath, waiting for the old woman to surrender, to sign away her life and disappear. I pressed the pen to the paper ink, bleeding a small black dot, and then I stopped. I lifted the pen. I looked at Tiffany, looked deep into her eyes until her smile faltered. I think I said, "Guy." My voice soft, but carrying to the back of the room. "I think I want to hear what my husband has to say first. I want to hear the will." Tiffany snatched the paper back, her face flushing with anger. "Fine, have it your way. Read it. Henderson, read it so she knows she is destitute." Henderson looked at me over his glasses. A tiny, almost imperceptible wink flashed behind the lens. He opened his briefcase, but he didn't pull out a paper document. He pulled out a laptop and a small portable projector. "Actually," he said, his voice suddenly strong, shedding the frail old man, "act like a heavy coat. Elijah didn't just write a will. He filmed one, and he had a lot to say." Henderson placed the small projector on the coffee table, pushing aside a tray of half-eaten canapés. He connected it to his laptop with movements that were sudden and precise, the shaking hands of the old man gone, replaced by the steady hands of the legal shark I knew him to be. He pressed a single key, and a beam of white light cut through the dim living room, hitting the blank wall above the fireplace where Tiffany had just torn down my family portrait. The image flickered and stabilized, and a collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. There was Elijah, larger than life, sitting in his leather wingback chair in the library that no longer existed. He was wearing his favorite navy cardigan, looking frail, but his eyes were clear, sharp, and burning with an intensity that made Jamal take a step back. "Hello, Jamal? Hello, Tiffany?" Elijah's voice filled the room, booming from the speakers, rich and deep. It was the voice of the man who built an empire, not the drugged invalid they had manipulated. "If you are watching this, it means I am dead, and it means you have tried to execute the plan I have known about for 6 months." Tiffany dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor, but no one looked down. Everyone was staring at the wall, mesmerized by the ghost addressing his murderers. Elijah leaned forward in the video, staring directly into the lens. He didn't look at the camera. He looked through it, piercing the veil between the living and the dead. "And to the young woman sitting on my sofa, wearing a ring she thinks is a family heirloom, I have a message for you," Keisha went rigid, her red jumpsuit suddenly looking like a target. "He knows," she whispered, her arrogance evaporating like steam. "I know you are not my spiritual wife," Elijah said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I know you are. Keisha Davis, an actress with a suspended license and a history of confidence schemes. I know my daughter-in-law hired you for $50,000 because I have the emails, and I know about the extortion." He paused, and a small, cold smile touched his lips. "You thought you were playing a role, Keisha, but you were walking into a trap. I sent a complete file to the Fulton County District Attorney this morning regarding your participation in a conspiracy to defraud an estate, along with the wire transfer records." As if on cue, a sound began to rise from the driveway outside. It started low, a mournful wail that grew louder and louder until it was a deafening shriek. Red and blue lights flashed through the sheer curtains, painting the room in chaotic bursts of color. Real sirens, the front door burst open with a force that rattled the windows. 3 uniformed officers and 2 detectives in suits marched into the foyer, their boots heavy on the marble. They didn't look at me. They didn't look at Jamal. They walked straight to the sofa where Keisha sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Keisha Davis," one detective boomed, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, fraud, and extortion. Stand up!" Keisha screamed a high, thin sound of pure terror. She tried to scramble over the back of the sofa, her heels slipping on the velvet, but the officers were on her in seconds. They hauled her up, her arms wrenched behind her back, the click of the cuffs loud in the sudden silence of the room. "I didn't call them?" Henderson said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Elijah did. He filed the report 3 weeks ago, scheduled to be activated the moment his death certificate was signed. I watched as they dragged the screaming woman out the door, her red jumpsuit a bright stain against the uniforms. She had come here to steal my life. Instead, she had just walked into a prison cell, and Elijah wasn't done speaking yet." The wail of the sirens faded down the long driveway, leaving a silence in the living room, so heavy it felt like it could crush bones. Tiffany was trembling, her face the color of ash. Jamal stared at the empty spot on the sofa where his co-conspirator had just been handcuffed. He looked at Henderson, then at me, and for the first time in his life, I saw genuine fear in my son's eyes. Not the fear of getting caught, but the terrifying realization that he was no longer in charge. Henderson cleared his throat. The sound was dry and final, like a judge banging a gavel. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single blue binder. It was not thick. It did not need to be. He opened it and smoothed the page with his palm. "Regarding the last will and testament of Elijah," King Henderson said, his voice cutting through the room, "there is none, or rather there is a pour-over will, but it is largely ceremonial because there is no estate to probate." Jamal stepped forward, his hands shaking. "What are you talking about? Dad had millions. The company, the house, the accounts." Henderson looked over his spectacles with a look of pure pity. "You are operating under the assumption that your father owned those assets when he died. He did not. 3 years ago, Elijah transferred every single asset he possessed into the Elijah and Viola King irrevocable trust. Irrevocable." The word hung there heavy and absolute. Tiffany let out a small, choked sound. She knew what that word meant. It meant unchangeable. It meant permanent. It meant that the forged letter they had forced a dying man to sign was worth less than the toilet paper in the guest bathroom. Henderson continued reading King Logistics, the primary residence located at this address. The investment portfolios and all liquid cash reserves are the sole property of the trust. And the trust has exactly one beneficiary and one trustee with absolute controlling power. He looked up and pointed a long finger directly at me. "Mrs. Viola Davis King." The room seemed to tilt. Jamal grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. "You gave her the company," he whispered. "You gave the company to a nurse." I stood up. Then I walked over to the table and placed my hand on the binder. I felt the warmth of Elijah's protection radiating from the pages. He gave the company to his partner, Jamal, to the woman who balanced the books when you were still in diapers, to the woman who saved every dime so he could buy his second truck. Henderson wasn't finished. There is one exception. The trust has made a specific provision for the education of Marcus King. Marcus looked up from the corner startled. He had been standing guard ready to defend me, but now he looked like a confused child. A separate educational trust was established 2 years ago. Henderson said, smiling for the first time, "It covers tuition room and board and living expenses for any university or art institute of Marcus's choosing, for as long as he wishes to study. It is fully funded and untouchable by any other family member." Tiffany let out a sob, loud and ugly. "But what about us? What about Jamal? We are his family. We have rights." Henderson closed the binder with a snap. "You have no rights, Mrs. King. The trust documents specifically state that Jamal King and Tiffany King are to receive 0% of the estate, 0 assets, 0 cash, 0 stock in King Logistics. You have been disinherited with prejudice." The air left the room. Jamal looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Mom, please, you can't do this. It is Dad's legacy. It is Dad's legacy." I said, my voice cold as steel, and he chose who he wanted to protect. He protected the grandson who loved him, and he protected the wife who stood by him. But you, Jamal, you and your wife, you are on your own. And Henderson isn't done yet. Henderson reached into his briefcase one last time, but he didn't pull out another binder. He pulled out a single thin envelope with a plastic window on the front. The return address was unmistakable: the Department of the Treasury Internal Revenue Service. "There is one more thing," Henderson said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "Elijah was a thorough man. He didn't want you to leave, empty-handed." Jamal looked up, a flicker of desperate hope igniting in his eyes. "He left us something." "He left you his forensic accounting files," Henderson said, sliding the envelope across the mahogany table. "You see, when Elijah discovered you were taking out predatory loans in the company's name and funneling the cash into private accounts to avoid taxes, he had a choice. He could have paid it off. He could have absorbed the loss. To save the family name." Henderson paused, letting the silence stretch until it was thin and tight. Instead, he formally notified the IRS. He provided them with the wire transfers, the forged signatures, and the proof that the funds were used for personal enrichment, specifically Tiffany's jewelry business and your gambling debts. He successfully petitioned to have the liability severed from King Logistics and assigned to the individuals who committed the fraud. "What are you saying, Tiffany?" whispered her face, turning the color of old ash. "I am saying that the $450,000 in unpaid taxes, plus the accrued interest and the fraud penalties, are no longer corporate debt. They are personal debt. Yours. And Jamal's." Jamal grabbed the envelope and tore it open. His hands shook so hard the paper rattled. He read the letter, his eyes bulging as he scanned the lines. This says immediate levy." Jamal stammered. "Yes," Henderson said calmly, checking his watch as of 9 o'clock. "This morning the IRS has frozen all your personal assets, your checking accounts, your savings, your investment portfolios, even that joint account you tried to hide in the Caymans. It is all frozen. You are effectively bankrupt." The sound that came out of Tiffany wasn't a scream. It was a soft, escaping sigh, like a tire losing air. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she crumpled to the floor in a heap of expensive silk and despair. She didn't swoon gracefully. Like in the movies, she hit the hardwood with a heavy, dull thud. Jamal didn't look at his wife. He looked at me. The hope in his eyes vanished, replaced by a feral, animalistic rage. He realized there was no money, there was no company, there was only debt and prison waiting for him. "You did this!" He screamed, veins bulging in his neck, spittle flying from his lips. "You witch! You poisoned him against me!" He lunged. He threw himself across the table, scattering the crystal glasses and the fake will, his hands reaching for my throat. Marcus jumped up, shouting. But he didn't need to intervene. Two large men in dark suits, security guards I had hired from my old neighborhood, stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. They caught him midair. One grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back, until Jamal howled in pain. The other grabbed his belt. They hauled him back, his feet kicking uselessly at the air. "Get off me!" Jamal shrieked, struggling against their grip. "This is my house. That is my money." "It is not," I said, standing over Tiffany's unconscious body, looking my son in the eye. "It never was. Get him out of here." As they dragged him toward the door, his heels scraping lines into the floor, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't sorrow. It wasn't regret. It was the feeling of a heavy weight finally being lifted. The surgery was over. The rot was gone. 6 months later, I stood on the sidewalk and watched the new owners carry their boxes into the estate. It was a young couple full of hope and dreams, just like Elijah and I had been 40 years ago. I didn't feel a pang of loss. I didn't feel a single ounce of regret. That house had become a mausoleum, a monument to betrayal and greed. The walls had seen too much, heard too many lies. Selling. It wasn't just a financial transaction. It was an exorcism. I drove away without looking back, leaving the ghosts of Jamal and Tiffany behind. I drove straight to the heart of the city, to a brick building that used to be an abandoned warehouse. Now it gleamed with fresh paint and new glass. Above the double doors, a modest sign read, "The Elijah and Viola, King Community Health Center." Inside, the waiting room was full. There were mothers with babies, elderly men with canes, families who had nowhere else to go. We offered free screenings, low-cost medication, and dignity. It was the dream I had put on hold to build the trucking empire, but Elijah knew. He always knew that my heart belonged to healing. I walked past the reception desk, greeting the nurses by name. I made my way to the server room in the back through the glass window. I saw Marcus. He was wearing a headset, typing furiously on 3 different monitors. He wasn't just the IT director, he was the heartbeat of the facility, ensuring that every patient record was secure, every system ran smooth. He looked up and saw me, a smile spreading across his face. It wasn't the guarded smile of the boy hiding in my guest room. It was the confident smile of a young man who knew his worth and knew his future was safe. I walked into my office. It was smaller than the library in the old house, but it felt bigger because it was filled with purpose. I sat down in my leather chair, the one that didn't hurt my back, and poured a cup of tea from the silver service on the desk. It was Earl Grey, Elijah's favorite. I took a sip, letting the warmth spread through my chest. Jamal and Tiffany were gone, consumed by their own greed and the relentless machinery of the IRS. I heard they had to sell their own house to pay the legal fees. I heard they were living in a rental apartment on the other side of town, blaming everyone but themselves. But their voices were faint now, like static on a radio station you are driving away from. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate takes energy, and I needed all my energy for the living. I looked at the framed photo of Elijah on my desk. He was laughing, captured in a moment of pure joy. I raised my teacup to him. "We did it, old man," I whispered. "We cleaned house." They looked at me and saw a grieving widow, a helpless old woman, a victim. They forgot who I was. They forgot that before I was a CEO, before I was a wife, I was a head surgical nurse. I spent 40 years in operating rooms, staring into open wounds. I learned a fundamental truth about survival, sometimes to save the patient. You have to cut out the rot. You don't hesitate, you don't bargain. You take the scalpel and you remove the infection so the healthy tissue can thrive. I did exactly what I was trained to do. I cut them out, and now finally I can breathe. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Was I too harsh on my own son, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more tales of justice and resilience. Here is the lesson learned from Viola's story. Viola's journey is a powerful testament to the fact that silence should never be mistaken for weakness. Her son and daughter-in-law saw an aging widow they could manipulate, forgetting that she was a woman who had spent decades navigating life and death situations in the operating room. The story teaches us that true strength often lies in preparation and observation, not in loud confrontations. Elijah's foresight to protect his wife from beyond the grave demonstrates that real love is about ensuring your partner's safety and dignity, even when you are no longer there to stand beside them. Most importantly, Viola teaches us the painful but necessary art of cutting out the rot. And we are often conditioned to believe that family bonds are unbreakable, regardless of toxicity. However, Viola showed that when people, even your own children, actively work to destroy you, you have the right and perhaps the duty to remove them from your life to survive. Justice isn't always about revenge. Sometimes it's simply about letting people face the consequences of their own greed while you choose to live in peace. Do you think Viola was right to leave her son with nothing but debt, or does family always deserve a second chance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.